Welcome to the Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practice Group's podcast, All Things Investigations. The Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practices Group represents many of the premier companies around the world, providing advice on issues spanning the full anti-corruption and compliance spectrum. In this podcast, host Tom Fox and members of the Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Practice Group will highlight some of the key legal issues involved in white-collar and other investigations, both domestically and internationally. We will tackle topical issues involved in investigations, as well as explore how companies can prevent and detect issues that arise in conducting investigations on a worldwide basis. Today, Zhen from Airbus joins Tom Fox and Mike Huneke to discuss her work in compliance at Airbus. It's a fascinating podcast. I know you'll enjoy it. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of All Things Investigations. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode of the award-winning All Things Investigations. Today, Mike Huneke and I are thrilled to have Zhen from Airbus, and she and Mike are going to talk to us about her journey and her experience. So Mike, with that, I'm going to pitch it over to you.
Thanks, Tom. As always, great to be back. And I'm super excited to be here today with a former colleague and current friend of mine, Zhen. Maylee's got a lot of great experience and perspective on compliance and compliance programs and company culture. And I'm very interested to hear her share some details and insights about those topics with us today. Maylee, welcome to the pod. I hope you're doing well. If you could start, introduce yourself. Tell us about your professional background and what you're doing today.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mike. I am quite delighted to be here today. This is my very first podcast as a speaker and not merely as a listener. So this is quite the new frontier for me. As Mike mentioned, he and I used to be colleagues, both when I worked at Hughes, Hubbard and Reed. I started my law career there back in the New York office. And then Mike and I started working together when I was transferred over on a temporary basis to the Paris office to work on a very top secret investigation, which ultimately became the investigation for Airbus, which resulted in the now very well known settlement agreements and the fine. And that is a big story that has been quite in the public eye. I currently am working in the ethics and compliance department at Airbus. So I went from being outside counsel to in-house counsel for a very big client and for a client that I had already been working with for several years. So that was quite the easy transition. Within Airbus, I've had several interesting positions, but my current one is actually leading the ethics and compliance team that's responsible for overseeing and deploying the compliance program across our Airbus commercial operations, which is quite a significant part of our business and of our footprint. So that is a little bit about me in a professional sense. And in a personal sense, I am a Chinese American from New York, but now I am living in France. So that in itself has been quite an interesting experience and has gone hand in hand with being a professional US qualified lawyer working for a European company in France.
Great. Thanks, Maylee. One topic we wanted to discuss today was how conducting business ethically and with integrity is increasingly important. And I'll preface that, or really follow that, Maylee, by saying, just saying that sounds obvious. When you start to think about what that means, though, it means different things for different companies and different countries. What exactly does that mean for you at Airbus today?
Thanks, Mike, for the question, and it is a very good one. You're quite right in that when you say that sentence out loud, that conducting business ethically and with integrity is increasingly important, particularly for global companies, seems very obvious. But what does that actually mean in reality, particularly for a company like Airbus, which is operating, in 180 countries essentially, and in a very highly regulated, very sensitive sector, because we cover not only commercial aircraft, but we also cover defense and space as well as helicopters. So that means we have a huge variety of stakeholders, from our investors, because we're a public company, to governments who are both regulating us and looking at what we do to make sure that we are performing and our products are conforming with standards, to also customers and suppliers, because we have a huge customer supplier base and our employees. These are all the stakeholders that are invested in our company. And when I say that it's increasingly important for us to conduct business ethically, it's because we also come from a unique history of having come out of a DPA. So we went through a phase where we lost a bit of, I think, the confidence and the trust for from our stakeholders, all of those various stakeholders that I just mentioned, and we've had to rebuild and regain that trust so that we can conduct business. And it's really important that we have that trust because we cannot be a profitable business, we cannot be a respectable business without the trust of all of those stakeholders. And they expect us to be able to do that, that we're selling our products because our products are the best products and not because we've engaged in misconduct, like confronting new risks as we head into the future, because aviation is at a pivotal point in its history in terms of our climate decarbonization needs. So our customers, our employees, our government stakeholders, our investors expect us to be doing business, not just what we do, but how we do it so that we can continue to be there for the future, continue to be there serving them and providing employment and providing these necessary goods and services.
Maylee, I imagine that many of your counterparties, particularly if they haven't done business with you before, when they initially see the name and maybe they do a Google search about Airbus and compliance, maybe they're scared by the investigations and the amount of the fine. In my view, you guys are probably one of the safest companies to do business with today because of your culture and your commitment to compliance. Do you have any examples you can share, maybe anecdotally, of maybe when people have been pleasantly surprised by what you've been able to tell them, or specific things you've done to rebuild that trust, like you were mentioning?
So I cannot speak about specific examples because we are a public company and I'm under an obligation of confidentiality. But I think the best evidence or example of rebuilding that trust is the fact that we were able to exit the both the consent agreement on the export control side, as well as the DPAs with the UK, US, and French enforcement agencies. We underwent a 3-year monitorship in which every element of our company, every element of our program was subject to scrutiny. And that was after the multiple years of investigations by the authorities themselves. So the fact that these authorities looked at everything and saw how much we had changed from the 2016 period when these investigations started to now, and they've seen that we've changed our very core of how we do business, their sign of trust and them letting us basically fly on our own now by officially closing the settlement agreements is the best example I can think of that's also in the public domain.
No, that's great. Totally understood, Bailey. Another topic we wanted to discuss with you is how ethics and compliance can be a business enabler and really a competitive advantage. And I'm sure all of us on this pod have experienced maybe an initial reaction, particularly from other stakeholders within the business sometimes, that, ethics and compliance is really a cost center, that it's not really enabling the competition. Is there anything you can say on that topic, Maylee, that you would use, obviously, generally speaking, to demonstrate to people how that's not correct?
Thanks, Mike. And this has actually been quite a passion for me because having gone through the external counsel role and then the in-house counsel role, where you're right, I think the view of compliance counsel is typically as a cost center, as I think an ivory tower, or as a naysayer, right? People just think that we tell them, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do this. But in my view, and I think in the view of our top management, being having a strong ethics and compliance program, one that is embedded in the business and is reflected in the culture, is really a competitive advantage. Why? Because integrity is ultimately good for the bottom line, not only in terms of not being fined for misconduct if and when it comes to light and there are investigations, but also investors are increasingly caring about the value and the integrity of how business is being done. Look at the recent regulations about, coming out of, I think, Europe, the CSRD on sustainability, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Governments and investors really care about how we do business. And so we're able to say, look, we have a great program. We're ensuring that we're complying with all these regulations, these new ones. We show that then we gain the trust of our investors and our governments, and we're able to actually use that as a marketing tool, particularly for customers and suppliers. It's also about reliability because they want to do business with someone, with an entity that is going to be doing business integrity with integrity. They want to say if someone says they're going to do something, we can trust on them to do it. That is what integrity means, and that they're going to deliver the product on time and on quality, and that is in line with what we expect. And so if your customers trust you to deliver, if they trust you to give them a product of the right quality that is undergone all the processes, and that you've sold it to them not because of bribery or fraud, but because it's actually the best product, that is really giving you a competitive advantage. And then on the employment side, I think now people are increasingly aware and sensitive to what kind of company, what kind of business are they in. I think the younger generation, I cannot believe I'm saying younger generation, but I am saying younger generation, really want to work for a company that they can be proud of. And so if you are a company that has a culture where the values are equality and integrity and respect, you will really be an attractive employer. And that's what we really need. I think across most industries, but particularly for aviation, we need young talent because we're really working with new technologies, trying to pioneer the next generation of aviation. And you need young talent, and young talent cares about not just what you do, but how you're doing it.
It's really interesting. And I imagine that's a self-reinforcing cycle if and when you can get it going, that having people who do care about that want to work for you helps get the right people in place, not only in compliance, but also in other functions throughout the company. So it's very interesting.
Thanks, Mike. And I don't think compliance, it's the way we approach it at Airbus, and I think a lot of other companies do, is that it is not it's not a single locus. It's not a single gravitational center of just the ethics and compliance team. It is dispersed both in terms of us actually having specific ambassadors or representatives, a real network of complementary employees who are doing this on top of their normal day jobs as well. But then it's also dispersed into the culture where each and every single employee feels that they are behaving with integrity, that they're behaving in line with their own ethical values and with the ethical values of the company in their day to day.
It's great. I imagine also you mentioned, Maylee, that it's not one single locus, either in place, but also probably not in time. As you know very well, compliance risks evolve over time. How you address those risks may evolve over time. Your business may evolve over time. What are some successful strategies you've seen for adapting to changes? Again, obviously, generally speaking, that might be interesting to Tom's listeners.
Sure. So I think one of the most common sayings is that the only constant in life is change. And that's certainly true for ethics and compliance and for the business environment globally. One of the best examples I can give you is really the geopolitical situation, which really began about 2 years ago now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the ensuing international sanctions regime that followed. That, with the speed and complexity of that sanctions regime, really forced a lot of companies, Airbus included, to have to react very quickly, but very correctly in a complex environment because not only was our business complex, but the sanctions themselves were rather complex. So we had to deploy that program in a short matter of time and also adapt to the changes that were coming out, I think, weekly or monthly at that point in time. And we did it successfully because we had the right people in place, because we had the right culture. Everyone was sensitive already because of our, at that time, we were still under the consent agreement, and we were still undergoing the transformation for our export control and sanctions culture, but because they were already sensitized to it, we were able to handle that and comply with all the sanctions.
What have you seen, Maylee, since you've been there as the greatest opportunity for your own growth? Has it been a change in role, a change in topic, expansive topics? Is there something you looking back at your time at Airbus, so to date, What's been something particularly rewarding or interesting for you?
I would say there are two elements of that. One is actually on the substantive knowledge development. Working for an in-house role is quite different from working for in an out external counsel
Yeah,
position,
please don't call it an
because
outhouse role.
sorry, external counsel,
Thank you.
outside counsel role.
Yeah.
It's quite different because I think when you're outside counsel, you are hired because you're like an expert in a particular area. So you really need to focus on that. Being inside counsel is very different because you always have to keep the global business in mind and what other elements outside of your particular wheelhouse are relevant and in play. And not only that, but you also have to foresee what are the future risks that you need to prepare for. And so that's been the most interesting substantive development, to have to expand not only my knowledge of the company and the business, but also of future areas of risk, future areas of law. One of those examples is, well, two of those examples is actually on climate. So the sustainability obligations that we have, and how we have to anticipate those, and how do we comply with those in terms of our reporting obligations. I am no means an expert on that, and we completely have a separate team who is an expert on that, and they help guide us in order to make sure that we report in line with our obligations. But I do have to have a general awareness of that, because that does then have implications on what we do and the diligence we do in terms of our third party screening. The second aspect of that, and it's also technology, the rise of technology. Airbus, like many other companies, is looking at ChatGPT, generative AI, how can we use it? And of course, I'm not an expert in that as well, but I have to be generally aware of what are the possible uses, what are the ethics issues. And so we constantly have to anticipate and think about these things, and then develop our own expertise, even though it's not an expertise that we were necessarily trained on in law school or in our previous working experience. And then I think on the second point is really I think the soft skills element has been the most interesting from a personal perspective, because being an American, being Chinese born, and then now living and working in southern France, it's really a big cultural shift. I thought I was quite good at navigating different cultures, but I think with living in France and the language issue, because I'm still learning French, not quite fluent yet, it's been really challenging because, of course, we're a global company, but there are going to be a lot of people from different international backgrounds here, and you have to work with them, and you have to make sure that there's no miscommunication across cultures, across languages. So that's been quite a soft skill learning experience for me, to really think about how do I communicate in a way that is culturally sensitive, in a way that I didn't really necessarily have to do as much when I was outside counsel based in New York or based in Paris, but that was really focused on only one small aspect of the business.
Yeah, there's something to be said, particularly in France, for the formality of even the email correspondence, right? Every once in a while, I get an email from one of our New York colleagues that's a bit blunt and direct, and I've been here long enough that it's almost shocking to me. And I can imagine at a company like Airbus, it's not even just 2 or 3 countries. You're dealing with people all over the world. As you mentioned, you have business essentially in 180 countries, and communicating on ethics and compliance in a way where the message is clear and the expectations are clear, I'm sure has been a learning curve, and would be a learning curve for me as well, but also something that would be quite interesting and rewarding, I hope.
It has been an incredibly rewarding experience to work for the company and to be exposed to the intellectual challenges, but also the cultural challenges. My view is, nothing should be too easy. Nothing should be too comfortable, because if you are, then you're not really growing. And being at Airbus, it's in the best way possible. Nothing is too comfortable and nothing is too easy.
Very good. And one of the other but somewhat related topics I was interested in discussing with you was how you've gained experience at building trust among teams. And certainly, and then maybe it's my turn to speak generally, I'm not speaking about any particular firm. Generally, there's a perception that at law firms, there's not a whole lot of emphasis, at least historically, on kind of culture, team building, and things like that. And certainly that's not true in all cases. That's at least back when you and I were in school, and not when the younger people were in school these days. It's also, I don't recall it being a point of emphasis in law school. And law school often isn't really a great preparation, for business. Do you have any advice or recommendations about how to build that trust among a team? Anything you've learned from your experience that you'd like to share?
Thanks, Mike. I think this question is really broader as well because it's about not just building trust within a specific team, but also building trust amongst stakeholders. So, in terms of building, and I think the techniques for both are the same, the tools for both are the same. This is going to sound incredibly basic, but it's really about transparency and communication and being clear. For me, building and working with a team that's located in different countries, which is often the way with global companies, you're working with people physically located in different cities or different countries, is to maintain communication using all the tools that we have at our disposal, whether it's chat or email or, God forbid, picking up the phone to actually just talk and being honest about expectations, being simple. I think that's one of the key elements of clear and transparent communication, which is to use not complex terms because I think complex terms are not necessary. It's part of the lawyer in us, where we want to use the specific terms that we learned in law school or that we learned in case books, but you need to communicate with everyone. And that's the hardest part, actually. Taking something complex and boiling it down, trimming it down to the essence, to the simple, so that it can be understood by anyone. That I find has been the most effective technique, but also the most difficult because it does take effort and it does take time. And that can be translated from, how you build a team, how you build trust within a team, to then how you build trust with the business, which is really essential for any ethics and compliance officer to be effective. You need to know who your stakeholders are. You need to know what kind of business, what are the risks, and essentially, if they know that you understand what their day to day is, what their risks are, and that the advice that you're giving them is clear and easy to understand, then they will be able to come back to you time and time again, particularly when some of the questions or when some of the situations are more complex, more risky. So
Well, I
to boil it
imagine,
down, it's clear communication and being transparent.
of course, I imagine that getting to know the business, what are the business's strategies, how do you guys compete, how do you go to market, all of those things help you have a sense of empathy with your other stakeholders when you're talking to them. And when we do training with new compliance officers, that's one point we try to make, which is you may feel pressure in these communications. It may be intense, but keep in mind that the person on the other end of the phone or in the Teams chat or whatever it may be is probably under their own pressures. There's a deal deadline, there's a quarterly deadline, there's financial reporting. And the more people understand the business and can communicate to give that trust, I think the better the whole exchange goes, in my experience. And so you trying to have this blend of being at least outwardly empathetic and genuinely, but inwardly still skeptical when you need to be, is it sometimes a balancing act, but I think an important one.
I think the point you're making is also really key because you mentioned finding common uh, ground and understanding what they're doing. Because if you understand what they're doing and what their risks are, you can understand where you share a common purpose. And if you are able to articulate that common purpose and create a sense of unity, a sense of same mission, togetherness, that really does help, even when some of those conversations or discussions can get a little prickly, or if you're taking opposite positions, then it's clear it's not personal. It's you're both united in your purpose of protecting the company, of enabling the business, but you're just taking different positions. So you can have reasonable people can disagree, but you could do it in a respectful way, as long as you know you're both reaching for the same thing, or as we like to say, you're flying in the same direction, you're rowing the boat towards the same path.
Well, Maylee, some of the things you've mentioned, you have said are basic, but actually sometimes executing even basic tasks can be complicated. particularly when we're trained, as you mentioned, in a different way. Tom, what questions do you have for Meili?
It may be a question, but it's really an observation that struck me, Meili. We talk in compliance about reporting to the senior management, reporting to the board of directors. There's obviously a legal and regulatory oversight. The business roundtable came out with 5 stakeholders in a corporation: shareholders, customers, employees, third parties who do business with the company or vendors, and then, of course, localities. But in listening to you, it struck me that airlines may have the biggest remit of any commercial operation literally across the globe, because you ticked off those 5, but then you went the general public, and everybody knows airlines. You're either an airline passenger or you're going to be. So you have literally the whole world watching you. You talked about green initiatives, environmental. I just wrote down some of these, and that you're really, I don't want to say under the microscope, but everybody's watching. And so you have to get it right, and you have to be ethical, and you have to do business ethically and in compliance. And by putting this forward, you're doing it with transparency in a way that, frankly, if there's a foul up, everybody's going to hear about it. And you're working very hard to prevent that. And it just struck me in listening to you go through your answers and your commentary with Mike. You guys are as watched an industry, literally, as any other industry across the globe. And what you and your compliance colleagues are bringing to this is a message that everyone, and when I say everyone, literally everyone planet wide, can rely on, that we're going to do business the right way. We're going to put a product out that we can be proud of, that's going to satisfy you as a customer. We're going to do business ethically with our consumers. We're going to do business ethically with our customers. We're going to comply with legal and regulatory oversight, all while trying to make money for our shareholders. And I really hadn't fully appreciated just the scope and breadth of what Airbus and any other airline manufacturer may be under, and why you've got to get it right in compliance.
That's an excellent recap and an excellent pinpointing of the core of what I'm trying to say. It really brings me to our Airbus mission, which is pioneering sustainable aerospace for a safe and united world. And I personally truly believe that. I know top management truly believes that. And I really believe that every single person at our company truly believes that, because aviation is so essential to the way we connect, but we need to do it in a way that is going to be good for the future, and we are trying to do it.
Mike, any final thoughts or questions?
No, Meili, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us and for your time. It was great to reconnect and catch up with you, and to hear a lot of really positive developments and that are going on at Airbus. It gives a lot of confidence for the future.
I have to say, on behalf of the compliance community, what you guys did and the comeback round for Airbus is something that I and others have studied. We appreciate the efforts you put into getting the company headed back in the direction it's headed now. And that by continuing to do that forward, I think you're going to be a leading light for many businesses literally across the globe. So thanks from the compliance community to you and your Airbus colleagues. But also thank you for coming on and sharing your story. It's been great. And Mike, thanks for getting this set up.
You're welcome. Thank you, Meili, very much.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Tom. This has been quite fun for me, and was really not as bad as I thought it would be, it being my first podcast. So thank you both for making it so easy and so fun.
Congratulations. Welcome to the community.
Thank you.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the award-winning All Things Investigations. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. All Things Investigation is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.